Good morning, good afternoon, good day to our distinguished guests from Canada and abroad, and welcome to a final edition of our Speaker Colloquium series. Today, we have the privilege of hosting Dr. Evan Hoffman, a renowned peace and conflict resolution scholar practitioner, who will be sharing his valuable insights and findings from his occasional paper titled Some Reflections on the Role of Power and Track to Mediation. Before we begin and I get into the objectives of the meeting and how we will proceed, I would like to give a few words to the director of the Ottawa Dialogues, Peter Jones, who is with us today at this meeting. So Peter, if you could join us and unmute yourself, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to very quickly step in at the very beginning to say that this is, as you said, the last one of this particular series. We've had 6 of these colloquium in the last couple of months, 2 in person at the university and 4 online. We'll take a break for the summer now, and we'll come back in the fall with another series. And I want to thank particularly all those on the staff of the Ottawa Dialogue who work so hard to put these together. And we've all shared the hosting duties, and I think it's been a very enjoyable and rich experience for us. So we thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall. With that, we'll get down to business. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And now going down to business, we will go for about an hour. We will start by learning from Dr. Hoffman as he presents and unpacks his paper, Reflections on the Role of Power and Track to Mediation. We will then take about 15 to 20 minutes for the Q&A section and then wrap up. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat and we will address them after the presentation. So Dr. Evan Hoffman has an extensive professional and educational background, which has involved living, learning, and working in numerous locations around the world over the last 20 years. During this time, he has provided consulting services to Global Affairs Canada, the Carter Center, the UN, the EU, the Vietnamese Ministry of Justice, and many other organizations. Evan is passionate, a trainer and educator as well, having taught students and at many universities in Canada and the USA. Over the last 20 years, he's conducted workshops and trainings with hundreds of community leaders, university students, and police officers and government officials from around the world. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Canterbury, which is in New Zealand, where his research focused on international mediation and sustainable peace agreements. He also completed a master's degree in post-war recovery studies at the University of York, United Kingdom, and the undergraduate degree in psychology at Carleton University in Ottawa. So there are 2 books that I wanted to highlight: The Mediator's Handbook for Durable Peace and International Mediation in a Fragile World, co-edited with David Harmont. So today, Dr. Evan Hoffman will delve into intricate dynamics of power and track to mediation. And I'm very happy, and we are truly fortunate to have him share his expertise with us. So without further ado, let us hear from Dr. Hoffman. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Mariana, and thanks to the entire team at the Ottawa Dialogue, Dr. Jones and the rest of your team, for not only the opportunity to present my reflections on the role of power and publish it as the occasional paper, but also for the opportunity today to share some deeper insights on what led to that paper. And I'll also mention it's wonderful to see many familiar faces here in the participants, or I should say maybe many familiar names. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. The title of the article has the word reflections in it, and that's not an accident, and it's because for whatever reason, one day I was reflecting on power and some of the different conflict resolution processes I've been involved with. And as Mariana just noted in the intro, I've worked on different projects in different parts of the world over the last 20 years or so. And so I saw a common thread that power was almost always at play in one way or another. And so I began to think about, well, could I somehow write down some of these reflections and maybe try to extract some lessons out of them. So I started to frame my thinking in terms of, power, what is it? And then, track two in very broad terms. And so as you'll see as the talk progresses, I haven't really I haven't stuck with a very narrow definition of these concepts. And I will admit that they're kind of all over the map, and I'm using the terms very broadly. So don't be alarmed by that. Anyhow, as I began to consider what are some of these reflections, I was able to reorganize them into some particular insights and different themes or categories. And then I thought, well, if I have these insights, that's wonderful, but we have to come up with some recommendations. Like what can we learn from them? What could we do differently based on these insights? So the presentation today will really be divided into those two parts. Then the first part, we'll talk about some of the insights. And then in the second part, I'll present the recommendations that stem from those insights. So it's important to note here in terms of setting the context that in my belief system or my worldview, I'm a firm believer that power is indeed a cornerstone of international peace and security. In fact, I've seen power at play in a very simple two-person interpersonal conflict, right? So it ranges from interpersonal conflicts to community conflicts, and certainly all the way to the realm of international peace and security. So my underlying premise that is behind all of the insights that I'll present is that power truly is central to the emergence of a conflict, its escalation, the ongoing maintenance of the conflict, and then the eventual de-escalation of that conflict. And so by extension of that, we would also say that if power is central to conflict, power is also therefore central to the major methods of making peace. And here I'm talking about peace building, peacemaking, or mediation. Those two terms are sometimes used interchangeably. And of course, peacekeeping. And all of those different peace types of processes or peace building tools or mechanisms utilize different types of power. And so I truly see power as being embedded in all of these things. And so that maybe is the first key insight, really, is that we have to be aware that power is at play in each and every conflict, and we should be mindful of the role of power. And we have to think about, I can't pretend there isn't a power imbalance. I have to be willing to address the power dynamics. And some of these beliefs of mine about power stem from my PhD thesis. And Mariana had noted that I studied what makes a peace agreement stable, right? So how come sometimes we see a photo opportunity, the two parties shake hands, they sign the peace agreement, and the peace agreement collapses days, weeks, or months later? On the other hand, how come we see the photo op where they shake hands, sign the agreement, and that peace lasts for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years? And one of the major findings of my doctoral research on that topic was indeed that, a mediator can't ignore the power dynamics. So some of these insights I'm sharing today are also have their origins in some research I did for my PhD thesis. So power really also, if we drill down into mediation specifically, we know that there's different ways to conceptualize mediation. Here's one method that has 5 distinct steps, from introducing the process all the way through to reaching an agreement. And I would also argue then that power intersects this mediation process at every stage. For example, the pre-talks or the talks about talks, or sometimes it's called the shuttle diplomacy, there's going to be power issues arise at that step, right? And if you jump to the very end there, about implementing the agreement, there's going to be power things embedded there. So power intersects this mediation process at every stage, and it's therefore deeply embedded in the process itself, the design and structure of the process, as well as who is facilitating it. So if we were to try to chart out the particular strengths and weaknesses of, say, track 1 versus track 2, this helps to illustrate, the inherent levels of power and how that can benefit the process or create a weakness. So in track 1, which is of course the official mediation, because that's a state actor, it's likely that there'll be many high value resources that mediator can bring into the discussion, and some of those resources the parties may want. So that's a strength. However, the weakness of that type of mediation, of course, is that it's often in the public realm and under public scrutiny to some extent, right? And there'll be news reports about it and stuff. So it creates a higher level of risk. Whereas that's the beauty of track 2, is it's inherently a different type of process, which may be more attractive for bringing the parties to the table. So bringing the party to the table, of course, is the notion of convening them. And we would say, does the mediator have convening power? Do they have the power to somehow bring the parties together? And that convening power comes from lots of different things, as we'll see in a moment, including the type of process. And so a track 2 process can be seen as more low risk, which might make it a more attractive option. So for the parties, they might say, well, we want to do something quiet in the background and more unofficial, right? And then if the process falls apart or something, it's easier to dismiss that process and say, oh, well, we never believed it was going to fix everything anyways, but we thought we would go and see what it was all about. In terms of the weaknesses of track 2, though, high-powered actors may be reluctant to participate in a track 2 process if they believe doing so will diminish their power somehow. And that comes from Guy and Heidi Burgess and Burgess. And track 2 processes may not have the ability to alter the conflict dynamics. So whereas the mediator in track 1 has resources that the parties may want, the mediator in a track 2 probably doesn't have a lot of resources and maybe can't alter the conflict dynamics themselves. So the other aspect would be referent power. So one form of a mediator's power is based on their reputation. And this exists if the mediator has the power to influence one or both of the sides because they somehow value that relationship with the party. So a mediator's convening power, the ability to bring people to the table, again, is based on reputation and how much the parties value having a reputation with that particular mediator. So what's interesting is that we talk about directive mediators who can force the party to the table. And so one of the classic examples of that was the Carter, Nunn, Powell team, who went to Haiti. I think it was the mid-90s, if I recall now. And they basically said, there was a political conflict occurring there around political leadership, change of presidents or something along those lines. And Carter, Nunn, and Powell basically said, you guys got to mediate this because we have the US military on standby. So there was a way to strong arm parties to convene. In other words, you come to the table or else there'll be a consequence. But it would be very, very rare, of course, for a track 2 mediator to do something because of that nature, because we never have those types of power, right? We have other types of power, such as soft power, such as our reputation. But we often don't have the option of force or threatening force. So when I was working for a project that was framed as a conflict prevention project in Guinea-Bissau, which is a small country in West Africa, and I'll probably be returning to this example a few times, we very quickly learned that we had little to no convening power, and this became a really frustrating aspect for us, which consistently hindered our ability to launch a new elite level mediation process. So as we got to know the country dynamics, we realized that the military was a huge actor. They were actually meddling in political affairs, and that a lot of the stability of the country had to do with the military. Also, a lot of the struggle in the country had to do with power struggle between elite leaders from different political parties. And so we thought, hey, we're well positioned to try to have those folks sit down and talk about some of their differences and see if we could come up with a way forward. And while we had access to them, which took a while to build, by the way, it took trust and reputation and being somewhat transparent, but we eventually got access to some of the highest level military and political leaders in the country. We made the mistake that access does not equal power, access does not equal influence. So yes, we could have a meeting with them, but that's about where it ended. We could not influence them beyond that. We could not somehow force them to the table or convince them. The best we could do is try to say that we can keep our door open. Our offer to mediate will be out there, and we would try to promote the value of mediation, saying, look, you could use this as a tool or an opportunity to put yourself out there as a peace leader, take a brave, bold new step for your country, and that we can't force you to come to mediation, but the offer there. So we could remind them of the value of mediation and keep the door open. Now, that said, they did not value a relationship with us at that moment for that particular reason. However, we were later on having power or being useful to the parties, because they eventually came to us, but they came to us because they wanted support to counter drug trafficking that was occurring in the country. And they said, how can you assist us with that? So what we ended up doing, maybe, so like I mentioned, is on the west coast of Africa, and cocaine was coming across from South America, across the Atlantic, entering into Guinea-Bissau, which is a coastal country. It had all kinds of chains of islands that were pretty much like anything goes. There was no no oversight or anything. So the cocaine would move into these chains of islands and then route its way through Africa and into Europe. And this became a major destabilizing factor. And we thought, well, we're not experts in drug trafficking or anything like that, but what we can do is, they came to us, they saw us as having some value to them. We can arrange a dialogue on this topic, and it has to be a secret dialogue, and it occurred in neighboring, well, no secret anymore, but it occurred in neighboring country, Dakar, where I organized a conference room in a little hotel. We had, when they put a sign out front, we had to have a fake what is the meeting for, right? And we had about 5 or 6 people fly out of the country to the neighboring country for kind of a secret meeting about what to do about drugs. So the other lesson for me there was that your power changes over time, right? So that at the point that we were trying to see an elite level mediation could be really helpful, for them, they weren't on the same page as us. They weren't perceiving us as being helpful at that point. But later on, when we could help out with something else, then they actually came to us. And there was no forcing the dialogue to occur. There was using threats or strong arm tactics and so on and so forth. Another insight is that mediation saturation can reduce your convening power. So, in other words, a mediator's power to convene or bring the parties together may be limited if there's lots of other potential mediators out there. This is called mediation saturation. And what happened, though, is when there's several competing offers to mediate, what I've noticed before is that the parties venue hop, and they go from the mediation process to that one, and they try to land on the process that somehow advances their interest the most, right? And so what happened is, I would argue that by venue hopping like that, you may be reducing the power of each of those processes. So it would suggest maybe there's some value in having mediators join forces and offer maybe one unified process, or at the very minimum, at least have some form of coordination between the various different mediation processes. So that, I think that would be an ideal situation. However, my observation has often been that mediators compete to some extent. And what ironically happens is that you end up with a power struggle between different mediation processes. So to this end, there's one view that states that every offer to mediate is only done because it somehow advances that party's self-interest. So let me repeat that, because it's pretty important. An offer to mediate, and this is maybe particularly true at the track 1 level when we're talking about state mediators, but the offer to mediate is often done because doing so would advance the interests of the mediator. So this begs the question, for example, why is China offering to mediate in the Ukraine conflict, or at least they were a few weeks ago? Why is Egypt looking to mediate in Sudan? And why is Canada offering to mediate in Cameroon? Which I'm not sure if you saw the news, but earlier this year, there was a big announcement from Global Affairs Canada that we've had some meetings with the parties in Cameroon, and we're going to be mediating a peace process for them. Literally 2 days later, the Paul Biya government, the government of Cameroon, issued a counter statement saying, we never agreed to mediation. This is not true, and we're not going to go ahead with that. So why would Canada want to mediate in Cameroon? So I think there's a topic here for further research. And that could be like what motivates. I think it's pretty clear that track one mediators are motivated by somehow advancing the interests of the state. But what motivates track two mediators, right? And that'd be an interesting survey, perhaps. Is it simply that they want to do good? I don't know. So I think there's more research there, and maybe more research on the topic of when and why do these different mediation processes, how could they cooperate? When have they cooperated in the past? What happens when you have kind of competing mediation processes occurring in the same conflict? And I think there's a lot of stuff around that. And David Lance, who's a name that might be familiar, he does some mediation research. He published an article basically that did explore, I can't remember the exact title of the article now off the top of my head, but it's a fairly recent article and it just won an award. It was about exploring competing mediation processes in Africa. So I'll admit I haven't read it yet. I haven't seen what kind of insights he came up with, but it is on my to read list. So then there's this notion of procedural power. The mediator, by the nature of their position, has control over the procedures. And so here we're talking about who comes to the table, who is included, who is excluded, and other process related matters such as, where will we meet? When will we meet? How often will we meet? What will we talk about when we meet? And so controlling the agenda and the frequency of the meetings. And so one really important insight or lesson I learned around this was that the exercise of procedural power can create a reputational cost for the mediator. And what happened is that we were facilitating a fairly large and complex multi-party process with some First Nations representatives. The First Nations representatives had been in some form of alliance. Now, I don't remember quite how formal it was or if it was just kind of an informal alliance. And they were negotiating with the government of Canada to talk about some self-government type of stuff. And what happened is there was a split in their alliance, and we were invited to facilitate a meeting where we would bring all of these different parties together and see if the rupture between them was so wide that they really should split and start to negotiate separately, which, by the way, might decrease their overall collective power. Or is the rift between them something that could be healed, and that maybe they could, stay united and stay in alliance and have be one unified negotiating party negotiating with the government of Canada, which arguably may have increased their power. And what happened is we organized this meeting, we had the venue booked, we had the invitations out, the hotels were booked, the flights were booked, everything was a go. And one of the parties refused to attend the meeting. And so they were kind of seen as the spoiler, so to speak. And what happened is the other party said, forget about them. They're on the, we need to move on. We can't just, we can't let them hold the rest of us hostage. And of course, we were thinking very closely about where does that leave us? We push on with this meeting, even though everything is booked, the hotels, the flights, without one of the parties present, or will that do more overall damage to the whole kind of conflict dynamics and our reputation? And so what happened is we said, from our perspective, our decision making was that it did not make sense to have that meeting with one of the parties excluded. So what happened is, for the majority of the parties that wanted to push ahead with the meeting, they suddenly became very angry with us. And for the one party that they said, wow, you're canceling the whole meeting on our behalf, I think they kind of felt like we were on their side. So it was a delicate question of, who do we exclude? Do we steamroll ahead without somebody? And when we exercise our procedural power, that impacted our reputation with both of those two different parties. So in other words, what I've noticed is that in a really highly charged conflict, everything becomes amplified and your every move becomes under scrutiny. So did you send an email to one of the parties first, then the other party secondly, for example? And if you did this and they found out about that, sometimes they'll get upset with you. Did you have a call with one party and not the other? Did you know that the language you use or the phrasing you used in your email might have been considered inflammatory by one of the parties? Did the agenda you circulate, did it reflect the needs and interests of both of the parties, or does it somehow favor one of them? Does the order of the items listed in that agenda is that somehow being perceived as favoring one party more than another? I have found at the very micro level, even from listing, like, here's who's going to speak first, and here's what we're going to speak about. All of that stuff becomes very highly charged. And some people view it as like, to let the other party speak first, you're undermining our power and you're not giving us a voice, right? So this is all within the procedure and procedural power. So I think it's pretty clear to think I've illustrated that, power imbalances are likely to occur and that we really need to be mindful of them and make a conscious effort to address them. The other insight I've noticed is that when there is a power imbalance, very rarely does it magically just improve on its own. And so usually it somehow becomes embedded within the deeper structures and systems and the bigger context around the conflict. So in another case we were working on, we detected a major structural imbalance between the First Nations representatives we were working with and the government of Canada. So this was during a multi-year mediation process that was aimed at resolving a really tense fishing dispute on the west coast of Canada. There had been protest, occupation of government offices, threats of violence, and we saw it was crystal clear. There's a huge imbalance here. So rather than ignoring that imbalance or pretending it didn't exist or pretending it wouldn't impact our process, we decided to take a more proactive approach, which involved helping to organize and arrange for money for the First Nations to hire a lobbyist. And as far as I know, it was the first ever fish lobbyist who was working in Ottawa. I think we have that dubious title. But yeah, because it was over them needing to promote their fishing rights and so on and so forth, we realized that the power really resides in the context and in the policy dynamics, and that is in Ottawa, in the capital city. So they needed to be influencing the policy environment. And so we helped them to organize lobbyists for that. In another example, or pardon me, with the same group, we also provided 2 days of interest-based training for them. And so we realized that they weren't professional negotiators, like the government side could hire people who had expertise in this, and that we flew 2 trainers from Victoria, British Columbia, up to the small secluded island of Bella Bella, which was where one of the villages was. And we provided 2 days of basically interest-based negotiation training, and that gave them kind of a basic framework to learn some of the skills for negotiating and some of the theory and how to present their interests in a convincing way to the other side. So the insight there is that building the capacity of the parties can help to balance the power. And there's also evidence of this happening in track 1 processes as well, because the now deceased mediator who led the Dayton peace talks that led to the Dayton Peace Agreement, Richard Holbrook, he also recognized that one of the parties did not have the same capacity as the other party, and they weren't quite as articulate in arguing their needs and so on and so forth. So he arranged for them to have a meeting, I believe it was in New York or Washington, and basically hired legal support to coach the parties, help them to get unified and so on. And so in yet another example of building capacity to help balance power, about a year ago, there was some Cameroonian separatists. They wanted to create a separate country called Ambazonia. And they had a meeting in Toronto at a hotel there. It was over 2 days or 3 days. And there was only about 3 external people invited. At the time, there was a Swiss mediation process happening in Cameroon. So the Swiss mediator was there. And then there was another gentleman there that was from the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, USIP. And there was myself and another Canadian present as well. So I was given about 30 minutes, I think about 45 minutes with the parties. And basically I was able to do a presentation with them where I wanted to introduce them to some basic terms about terms and concepts around negotiation. So they had kind of a common language to work from. That I talked to them about some kind of high level, strategic thinking, like they have to, get their needs, they have to make their, their list of needs very articulate and so on and so forth, and help them to strategize. So that's another example of when you see a power imbalance, you say one side needs some assistance, how can we work with that side to put them on a more equal footing so that when they enter into the negotiations or the peace talks or the mediation, they have a better footing. So as I've noted, power is often deeply embedded in the social institutions, and power can be used for peaceful, like constructive or destructive purposes. And often that decision is influenced by the different leaders, right? So one of the ideas there then is that you can try to move a situation from destructive power to constructive power by promoting the rule of law, for example, or supporting justice, or having peacekeepers establish some basic security or a negative peace. So in other words, if it's they're fighting each other, how do we begin to shift that power relations, right? And so for Guinea-Bissau, we looked at the idea of bringing in unarmed civilian peacekeepers. We also reached out to the UN to send regular peacekeepers. And this was that, to help establish some basic security in the capital city, because, different factions control different neighborhoods and due to their use of violence. Another aspect about Guinea-Bissau is that it was pretty much a lawless environment, and most actors could act with a sense of impunity. So that's why they would use their power for destructive purposes, because there's no consequence, right? So we did it. We hired 2 lawyers from Ottawa to fly to Guinea-Bissau and do a week-long needs assessment of the justice system. And they found, there were some very basic problems with the justice system there, including that the police didn't bother arresting people and locking them up because they didn't have the money to have a secure jail to put people in. So the police were afraid to lock someone up, because if they put them in jail, they could just walk out the next day and then seek retribution. So in other words, what we're talking about then is using different mechanisms, including working with leaders to try to get them to, and working with the policy environment and the context and the justice system to try to shift power from being used destructively to more constructively. Another insight is that power is dynamic. And so I've already noted that it's changing all the time. So your power is constantly changing, and so too is the power of the parties. And so sudden, unexpected developments in the power dynamics can happen, and you should be prepared for that to happen. So this insight leads to the first recommendation that I'll present here. And that's basically, how do the parties perceive the mediator? To what extent do they value a relationship with us? Should we change our mediation team or something like that in order to ensure that the parties will want to engage with us? Next, I mentioned a sobering lesson that we had in Guinea-Bissau, that, access does not equal influence. So while we may think we have power because we can get access or meetings with these high-level people, that's where it ends, and we don't have the power to actually influence them. Procedural power is linked to reputational power. And so that's, I guess the recommendation there is be mindful of how you use your procedural power, and that when you exercise your procedural power, you may be creating reputational costs when you exercise it. The next insight is work to balance the power. And I would say, assess the balance of power, work with the context, including the policy environment, look at questions of who's funding the initiative, does the funding create further inequalities, and so on and so forth. Lastly, I would say utilize leaders' influence. So aim to work with influential leaders from all different sectors, since they can model the peaceful use of power, and their followers may decide to act differently by choosing peace over violence if their leaders endorse it. And that concludes the presentation. So thank you for your attention. And I believe we're going to a question and answers.
Yes, thank you, Evan, for such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation, and definitely had lots of thoughts on different aspects and stages of mediation, the peace process, especially that we always need to assess the situation and need to be aware of multiple powers that exist. So as you said, we will open the floor to questions and discussion. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. Maybe in the meantime, as our audience is coming up with, Oh, we already have lots of questions. So maybe we'll go straight ahead to Adam. Adam, would you be able to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much, Dr. Hoffman, for those insights. Very interesting. I wanted to ask you, a lot of what you're talking about is very practical matters related to, the real world. But I'm wondering if you've drawn any theoretical conclusions related to how these realities make you see different schools of mediation differently than before you had done this research. I have my own biases there. I'll share it and just see what you say. But for many of the reasons that you describe, I have a strong bias in favor of narrative theory and the use of narrative in conflict, because I think it's the most sophisticated school of how to practice mediation in regard to power, stemming from the deconstructionist tradition, people like Sarah Cobb, for example. And I'll put a citation into the chat, which I believe is a real classic in terms of deconstructing power and mediation that I always turn back to. But yes, so I'm just curious, has your perception of the theory that frames the practice changed because of this, and if so, how?
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for a wonderful question. I think I heard maybe two parts to that question, and one is, have these insights altered your theory or your concepts of power? And then I think your second part there was, based on that, do you see which is the best kind of mediation process and the most powerful one? So let me start with the first part of that. The answer is yes. That I intentionally at the start of this paper tried to say, I'm not going to give you a formal academic definition of power, and as you're going to see, my concept of power is kind of all over the place, right? And I could have given you my definition, and over the years, I have come up with one that I'm happy with about the combination of power being the utilization of resources and having the right skills to mobilize those resources to create some kind of outcome. That outcome being either making something you want to happen, or preventing something you don't want to happen from happening. So power, theoretically, that's my definition of power. Power equals resources mobilized by skills as a function of a clear decision to create an outcome. And so based on that thinking, if I go back to maybe the slide with the chart with the track 1 and the track 2 and the strengths and weaknesses, I would say that my view is that I do not see one particular style of mediation as being, heads and shoulders better than than another one. And if anything, I've grown an appreciation for the fact that sometimes, mediation is not even the right fit or the right answer for a conflict. So that's the first question: is mediation even right? And then there would be the question of what type of mediation. And sometimes, track 1 is the better approach to use for that particular conflict. And in some cases, maybe track 2 is more attractive and a better fit because it's precisely that the track 2 mediators don't have power, that it's a better fit somehow. So it's kind of a cop-out answer, I suppose, Adam, but I would say I don't see one particular style or method of mediation being better than any other one. And I kind of recognize the pros and cons of each type. And I think it's a matter of trying to match the type to the specific case. Now, that said, I fully acknowledge your reasoning for saying that narrative mediation is a very important one. And I would agree with that, the notion of, having groups tell their story and share their narrative, right? And what is going on from your perspective versus your perspective. And I believe, it was Dr. Jones in a training that he and I did with the Government of Canada Foreign Affairs people at one point. I recall that I recall this phrase because it often occurs to me, is that Dr. Jones said often the parties will come together and there'll be some initial throat clearing, I think is what he said. And this is the idea that they have to voice their concerns and get all of their initial kind of say what they need to say, get that off their mind, clear their throat, and then you can kind of sit down and the vibe changes, and there's now maybe a more deeper conversation about trying to move forward. So again, I think that's part of narrative. So yeah, great question. Thank you. I think Jeff had his hand up next. Jeff.
Thank you again for the talk. It was very informative. I'm actually a master's student at NIPSIA, and I did a course with Dr. David Carment, and we actually read your paper about Guinea-Bissau, so it's quite interesting to actually talk to you, and I think it helped out a little bit with choosing Guinea-Bissau.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So Dr. Carment, like, to go back, I don't want to interrupt your question, but
Oh, no worries.
basically we were charged with trying to develop a project to prevent violence in certain somewhere in the world, and Dr. Carment and his team were doing some early warning type of analysis, right, with the country indicators for foreign policy, CIFP. So he narrowed down to a list of 3 countries, he and his team. One of them was Guinea-Bissau. The other one was Guyana, I think, but the Carter Center was working there. And the third one was Papua New Guinea, which is near Australia, but the Australians had an interest there. So we eventually landed on Guinea-Bissau because we said no other major actors seem to really be doing much there. But yeah, a lot of that goes back to Dr. Carment.
Yeah, it was interesting reading that for sure. The question I have is sort of about a lot of these examples you brought up. There's often like an ethnic dimension to it. You're talking about like Indigenous people, talking to the government of Canada, and often a lot of protracted conflicts tend to have sort of like deep underlying ethnic tension. So I was wondering, how do you think that affects the sort of the calculus on power? Since often a lot of these relationships can be like deeply embedded in society, how they view, and often a lot of people on both sides, they have sort of embedded interests in keeping the division. So I was just wondering what your perspective on that is.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I have a two-part answer to that, Jeff. So thanks for that question. I think on the one hand, you're absolutely correct that those in power seldom want to voluntarily give it up, right? And that they will use whatever tools and processes and mechanisms that they have at their disposal to try to maintain their power. And we see that in so many different conflicts, right? So that is a dynamic that I think is one that creates a great challenge for a mediator about, if someone has power and there's this imbalance, you could try to raise the levels of power for this party, but will this party ever voluntarily give up their power somehow to balance it like that? And so I would say that that's probably very unlikely. And then the other part of that is what you mentioned, is there's this power imbalance. And I think we also have to be, and I probably didn't give enough attention to this, but we also have to be mindful that yes, those power imbalances can have historical origins and a historical basis. So when we talk about First Nations in Canada, we'd be remiss not to talk about the historical imbalance of power that is there, and that's now become in many ways part of the deeply embedded structure. So when you're trying to balance power, you're fighting the fact that the party with more power doesn't want to give it up, but you're also fighting the fact that the bigger context and the policy and whatever the history and all that might be resistant to the power also, because there's a deeply embedded structural imbalance, right? And so it's a difficult challenge to change power. Thanks, Jeff. Jennifer?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that talk, Dr. Hoffman. The question I had is, in looking at I looked at when you're mentioning about the mediator saturation, and I looked at your reference article about from Lundgren and Svensson, the surprising decline of international mediation. And so what they're saying from their data set, and I know you've seen the article, is that about actually, as opposed to there being even though there is an increase in mediators globally, they're saying about 2/3 of all conflicts now experience no international mediation whatsoever in a given year. So it's less and less conflicts. And he points that to being the result of kind of 2 factors, mainly looking at a change in the norms of conflict management that's come out of the 9/11 tragedy and the war on terror. So kind of looking at an increase in Islamist fights, terrorist conflicts, terror listings.
Yeah.
And since the terror list in 2001, saying the last 96 years of conflict, only something like 2 of them involved Islamist conflicts. So anyway, just wanted to see what you thought about that as the kind of contradictory, they kind of note that Western countries have been the key architects of kind of behind the mobilization of international mediation capabilities, but they're the most ardent pursuers of anti-terror sanctions and counterterrorism. So we're not really seeing, they're saying in the article, there's like less and less, even though there's more and more conflict, especially with like a 56% rise in Islamist conflicts around the world. There's less and less this kind of contradiction of a rise in mediators, but a decrease in mediation globally. So just wondered what you have to say about those types of trends and their findings of their research.
Well, I mean, it's a very curious thing, isn't it? And so, I mean, I can think back to conferences and stuff that I went to in the early 2000s and even late 90s where people were saying, like, for example, African problems should be solved by African mediators, right? So local solutions to local problems. And even now, when I'm tracking what's happening in Sudan, I've seen that sentiment arise again. And so there's a whole question there for me. And I think I mentioned, like, I see more research being needed, but yeah, like, why do certain track 2 mediators offer to mediate? Track 1 mediators, I think we could definitely say they do so to advance their own interests. And so maybe that's why we're seeing so many Western countries offering to mediate, because somehow in their calculus of what creates security for them, they need to have security in this situation or this region and that region and that region. So that's why we might see Western offers being made all around the world. And yeah, so there's this question of, like, who makes an offer? Why do they do it? What happens when there's multiple competing offers? And I don't know if I really answered your question, but I think it's, what I'm trying to say is, I think it's a very complex topic, and I think there's more research required. And I don't have answers necessarily. I just have a bunch more questions about who mediates and why, and what do they get from it. And like I said in the presentation, right, like, if you look at who's offering to mediate in Ukraine, I mentioned China, but if you look at the list of people, there's the Vatican also offered at one point, which I found very curious. In Sudan, if you look at, I think I mentioned Egypt made an offer, but there's also a process going on in Doha. I think there's a Middle Eastern mediators working on that Sudanese conflict. And so, yeah, there's all of these competing offers, right? And it'd be interesting to study, why does one kind of emerge to the forefront and the others fall away? I don't know what the answer to that is.
Yeah, and interesting to see the countries providing mediators, when I thought it would be more international, like NGOs, organizations that would be seen as more neutral parties. So is that a trend as well, that you're seeing more countries kind of offering to mediate versus I would assume more neutral bodies or NGOs? Was that more the norm in the past?
It could be the case that I just don't have access to that information. Like, it's easy to jump on Twitter and use some hashtags for Sudan and Ukraine and see the official offers to mediate by different countries. But I'm not sure if there was a small NGO that offered that necessarily we would see that information out in the public realm. So yes, perhaps there are lots of NGOs offering to do quiet diplomacy or track 2 dialogues and stuff like that, but it's just not out in the public realm for us. So I can't really say if there's a trend there. I don't think I have enough information to confirm that. But what I can confirm is there certainly seems, when you look at Ukraine, Sudan, there's, and Cameroon for that matter, there seems to be lots of competing kind of offers that put out there, and some get accepted and some don't. Yeah. Interesting topic. Maybe future research article.
Indeed, it's very interesting. I wanted to add or ask one more question. You've mentioned in your occasional paper the involvement challenges in involving women in dialogue that may be affected by, by gender norms or other local aspects in the societies. Can you just address that a little bit for those of us who are interested in like feminist theories and gendered aspects of conflicts and women and peace? How do mediators approach that?
Thank you for that question. So this is something that I didn't spend time talking about today, but it is mentioned in the occasional paper. And the example that was given was that the donor for one of our projects said basically, and this is much to their credit, they said, when you go and set up this project, we want to have equal representation from men and women, right? And what happened, well, I'll tell you what this project was. It was a conflict prevention project in Burma and Myanmar is one example. And it was funded by the Canadian government. So this was part of their stipulation for funding the project, and it was a multi-year project frame as conflict prevention. And one of the things we were going to do is run a series of workshops, which we did in fact end up doing, on negotiation and conflict resolution, working specifically with civil society, because our thinking was that civil society is a stabilizing force in the country, and that coming out of military dictatorship, the civil society was struggling to like we could help by building their capacity. So we ended up sending, I wasn't the trainer, but our company ended up sending a trainer over multiple trips, like 4 or 5 times, to do all kinds of training in negotiation skills with civil society. And what happened is they tried to get that gender balance in the room, but because the society where we were working, that's not, the men there had more power and more prominence and often occupied those the higher power roles, that dynamic in that culture translated into our training room, where we had like maybe a table of 3 women and then everyone else was men. And so that also raised another topic for us. Like, we can have the best intentions, we can aim to have this happen, but again, it's kind of like a context or a cultural thing that we tried to make this balance, but it didn't translate. So, I mean, I think it's good that the government of Canada was thinking about that and stipulating it in their funding and aiming to do that. And our intentions were the best intentions, but in practice, because of these cultural differences, it translated into our room and we couldn't make it happen.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your question, and Dr. Hoffman for your comprehensive responses. I think to wrap up, there is one particular line in your paper that resonated with me a lot, and it goes like, if we consider that the definition of word ingenious is to be clever or inventive, then the modern peacemaker must be ingenious about the role of power in mediation. And I think our discussion today and your presentation shows that we truly, or those of us who are interested in mediation, must truly be ingenious about the role of power and the work that we do. With that, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to Dr. Evan Hoffman for your illuminating presentation and generously sharing the secrets and expertise with us. And the research insights will undoubtedly contribute to ongoing pursuit of conflict resolution and peace building efforts. So this is the last of our speaker colloquium series, and participants today will receive a follow-up email from us with links to previous recording and to this talk, and we will also share the links to policy briefs on our website. And I encourage everyone to stay in touch with us on social media for most up-to-date news and other knowledge products and follow-up discussions from the Ottawa Dialogue. So if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you. Thank you everyone so much for joining.